Ever since my Picross 3D video last year, I have had a strong hankering for more classic Nonogram puzzles. As someone who is a big fan of Picross 3D as well as Round 2, I was a little disappointed with my previous findings turning up in a lack of Picross 3D spiritual successors. Well, recently I was browsing around and found another Picross 3D inspired title that happened to release at the end of last year, Nonogram 3D Mega Puzzle. I was very surprised and excited to say the least, not just that, but thankful as I was actually pre-approved to receive a review key for the game. Special thanks to Keymailer and 7James for that, so I thought it would be fun to take a look at this and a few other games that give their own unique spin on the classic puzzle format. Those of you who saw my previous video may remember my complaints with Voxelgram, which I decided to revisit recently, and I did enjoy it to a certain extent. Honestly, I love the game's presentation, it's just really clean, and now that I've given it another chance, the controls are much more intuitive than I gave it credit for. Not just that, but it gives you a good amount of informative tools to help with each puzzle. Still, my biggest issue with Voxelgram came down to the lack of a penalty system similar to that of Picross 3D. Instead, it gives you a toggle which lets you know when you've made an incorrect mark or subtraction to a given row or column. This is where I felt it took after round 2 and just how confusing its puzzles could be. I did try to leave the hints off because it took away from the satisfaction of solving the puzzles with minimal hints, but in doing so I always ended up making them take 2 or 3 times longer than they really should have. Because of this, I was naturally cautious going into Nonogram 3D. But this game leans more on the end of Picross 3D Round 2 with all of the classic gimmicks like multicolor block painting and cube and circle markers. The controls are frankly a little less intuitive here. Dragging to clear or paint a specific row or column of blocks has to be done without straying to another, or else it just gets cut off, which happened more times than you would think. Then we have the splice tool, which instead of being mapped to the scroll wheel like in Voxelgram, it's instead assigned to 2 floating buttons which you can't even drag, you have to click them for each layer you want to splice through. This is notably slower and clunkier, albeit not by much to be fair, but if the devs were considering any feedback, this and dragging to paint or break blocks are 2 major points of contention which I'd like to see changed. That as well as adding a quick destruct button for any 0 blocks in a puzzle like Round 2 had. I don't think the presentation is as strong as Voxelgram either, as this is another area where the game takes inspiration from Round 2, mainly with the outcomes of the puzzles not being voxel based. Half of the time I don't think the outcome even looks that much like the thing it's trying to be, whether it's because of the strange color scheme or rough modeling. Obviously this isn't a game breaker, not for me at least, I just think it's significantly less charming. However, what's most important to me is the core gameplay, which fortunately, despite how rough around the edges the game looks and controls, I got accustomed to it and found it way more enjoyable than Voxelgram. A lot of this comes down to it being more faithful to Picross 3D and especially Round 2, but it hits a much better balance with its difficulty not being too easy but just difficult enough to be satisfying to solve. We also have an actual penalty system at play, brownie points for that, even if it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. Aside from that, there's a decent amount of content here, not quite comparable to Picross 3D 1 or 2, though those games had a lot of extra content which I feel this game could capitalize on through DLC or what have you. There is also a procedurally generated level function similar to Voxelgram, but I don't care for either game's level generators because these aren't some specific object you have to carve out, it's just a cube mass with some random chunks taken out. I can see where this would appeal to some, but to me it's just kind of a boring feature. I do think Nonogram 3D would benefit from having a level editor with Steam Workshop functionality, but I'm not gonna pretend like I know how much work that would take. Honestly, I wish I could say I was into Voxelgram as I was with Nonogram 3D because it's so cool having another one of these games to play. Nonogram 3D feels a bit scuffed, but it's super fun, addictive, and it's the entire reason I even wanted to make this video in the first place. I always thought Picross 3D was a much more niche thing, but clearly I must have been wrong because this isn't even where it ends for Picross 3D successors. Interestingly enough, there was actually a VR game called Puzzlecross. I chose not to buy it for the video though, as unfortunately it's been left to rot in early access ever since it was released nearly 10 years ago. It's a huge shame because it's a really novel and perfect idea to translate into the VR space. Just the idea of being able to physically walk around the cube as you carve it out or spinning it around with your hand sounds so cool. It sucks because I really wanted to check this game out, but to this day it only has about 30 minutes of content and I'm not about to spend $10 on that. I also found Picross, a mobile exclusive game. As you might expect, it plays a lot slower due to its somewhat awkward control scheme. Thankfully, it does let you play a decent amount of levels for free before asking you to buy the rest. The last 3D Picross game I could find was Picross, which is probably the worst one I've played. It's incredibly disorienting, not just due to the camera control and the numbers not shifting orientation based on your camera position, but also because of this horrible red filter that flashes on and off the screen when you hold control to delete blocks. The only positive here is that the first 20 levels are free to play, with the remaining 70 or so being paid DLC, but I could barely stand this game for 17 minutes before I nearly got a migraine. I just don't think I want to stick around for the rest. Frankly, I think my head might explode if I did. Honestly, it's a shame to see that no matter which option you go with among the Picross 3D spiritual successors, they all have a unique problem which stems from their developers wanting their take to stick out from the original. Voxelgram and especially Nonogram 3D are certainly the best I've played in polish and puzzle design respectively, so I would say to still give those ones a look. If there are somehow any others I've managed to overlook, I would love to hear about them. Until then, I have a few more traditional 2D Picross games I'd like to talk about that put their own spin on the formula. First up, we have PictoQuest. This is an attempted merging of Picross with RPG elements, and as you might expect, these elements are very light, boiling down to an added time gauge and a number of levels that, once filled, gives the enemy a turn to attack. However, fully solving any row or column will reset the targeted enemy's attack gauge, so it's sort of a balancing game, having to alternate between enemies to keep them in check, all the while trying not to crack under the pressure of solving the puzzle. You also have access to a limited but useful arsenal of items, which are gained through the side quest levels, the shop, or through random chance in the middle of a puzzle. I tried to save these for the boss levels, but the game got to a point where I was frequently making mistakes due to the constant pressure of enemy attack gauges. If there's anything PictoQuest has shown me, it's that I prefer Picross to be kept as a purely casual experience, because with any amount of rushing, I just crumble and completely lose focus. I need to take my time with Picross, and so even when I was doing a non-timed puzzle, I started getting really impatient and irritated with myself. This is not a bad game, but I just don't think it's my kind of Picross game. I could maybe see myself coming around to it in the future if I got really good at solving nonograms super quick, but for now, I think I need a break from it. Next up is Pixel Cross Adventure, which has you exploring your hometown to recover various objects which have been pixelated thanks to an invention made by your professor, roommate, legal guardian guy. I mean, I assume he's just your roommate, honestly, I have no idea. Apparently, this is the third game in the series, so unfortunately, I'm probably missing out on some really crazy Pixel Cross lore. As for the game itself, it's your standard Picross fare, but I could see myself getting really addicted since each puzzle contributes to repairing the overall world, which is really satisfying in its own way. Not much else to say about this one, it's really nothing too crazy. Lastly, we have Murder by Numbers, which was by far the most disappointing game I played for this video. It attempts to juggle a murder mystery visual novel clearly inspired by the likes of Ace Attorney with Picross, but I'll be honest, the Picross feels very tacked on here. Outside of Picross, the gameplay consists of very basic investigative work and interrogation of various suspects, and I do mean basic. The writing is really nothing special, it's like an 80s sitcom, and the story is just as uninteresting. It's a real shame because I do think it's a novel idea with quite a bit of potential, but it feels too campy for me to get invested into. As you might suspect, I've pretty much run dry my talking points for any Picross game because at their core, it's the same gameplay with minor differences. That's what got me interested in these games in the first place, but I'll be honest, I think I prefer Picross on its own. It's a cute idea to throw in a detective story or light combat elements, but ultimately the additions feel superfluous, only taking away from what I really like about these puzzles. Picross 3D and its spiritual successors prove there is more potential for this puzzle format, but I don't know, these 2D games just aren't it for me. This is most likely the last time you'll ever see me talk about Picross games because I'll admit I had to stretch it a bit to even make this video, but hey, any excuse to talk about some niche junk that appeals to only me, I will take. So till next time, I've been Wyrlwind, and go play some freaking Picross.